Welcome to From the Magic Pencil, Voices of Writing Through. Our goal is to amplify the voices of people whose stories need to be heard. Today we are talking to Jess Blackledge, who for 5 years was our deputy director at Writing Through. She was our first full-time staff member and was such a wonderful, valued member of the team. Writing Through definitely would not be what it is today without her dedication and hard work. In this interview, we discuss her move back to the UK during the pandemic, the culture shock that she went through after living for a decade in Asia, and about her interesting new job. It's so much fun to be able to welcome our next guest, Jess Blackledge. She has been a part of Writing Through since the beginning and started as our first assistant director and held that position until she relocated in 2020. So Jess, I'm really excited to hear about your thoughts on your new life and the new challenges and what you're finding. You can just start by telling us all a little bit about who you are and what you're doing now.
Yeah, sure. I'm really excited to be talking to you. So as you said, I was working with Writing Through for almost 5 years, I think it was, in Siem Reap in Cambodia, and then moved back to the UK where I'm from. I was very prepared to come back and in the middle of the height of a pandemic, and at the time COVID hadn't hit Cambodia at all, really. And I was living my life as pretty much normal. Not much had changed apart from with Writing Through, everything went online, which turned out to be a really positive thing. But in terms of my everyday life, nothing had changed at all. And then I moved back to the UK and I realized that the rest of the world really had changed quite a lot. And so that was a huge shock. So I was prepared to be in lockdown for a long time, or to at least I just thought I would be unemployed for a long time and just spend some time catching up with family and making up for lost time. But what happened was I moved back prepared to quarantine for 10 days with my mum. In that 10 days, we went into lockdown, which didn't let up properly for the next 5 months. So I ended up in my mum's house, which is in the middle of Cornwall, which is very rural, in the middle of nowhere, which was actually the perfect place to spend lockdown because there's nothing else to do anyway. And it's really beautiful. And I just thought I'll while away the time by applying for jobs. Managed to find a job relatively quickly and started that job in January. And so what I do now is that I work for a theatre in Plymouth, which is a city in the southwest, the Theatre Royal Plymouth, and I run a citywide project, playmaking and performance project for children and young people in deprived areas of the city. So I'm the creative producer on that project. So my role is, among many things, mostly strategically planning the project and planning a legacy for the project. It's a 4-year project. It was a 3-year project. Now it's 4 years because of COVID, which is good. And trying to see how we can leave the arts in communities of low cultural engagement and high deprivation after this project is over. Yeah, the project is, it's a pilot. There are 5 of them in the UK that have been funded by the Arts Council. And it's a pilot to see whether we can use this methodology of co-creation with young people to reach harder to reach communities, and if it's successful then they'll give us more money in the future, basically.
One thing that I'm wondering about is that you lived, besides living in Cambodia for 5 years and working with Writing Through, you also lived in Korea. You had lived for what, 8 years in Asia or something like that?
10, actually.
And working as a teacher and in the educational sphere throughout Asia. And then you plop yourself down into the UK where you grew up and whose school system you went through. I'm wondering if you're seeing any similarities or huge differences between the way people are learning and the way schools are functioning in the UK versus what you've discovered in Asia.
Most of the schools I'm working with at the moment are primary schools, so up until age 11. I didn't tend to work with that many young people. It's funny because I think that I felt really unqualified for this job when I got it, just because I haven't lived here for so long and I've never worked for a theatre. I've never really worked in the UK properly, especially in the arts. And so I thought, I don't know what I'm doing. I'm going to have to wing a lot of this, and I do have to wing a lot of it, but actually there are so many transferable skills, and a lot of that is to do with working with young people, because I just realized that young people are young people everywhere. And I realized that even in writing through, even in Cambodia versus Vietnam and Singapore, they're all young people all going through the same thing, even though they're wildly different culturally and linguistically and sometimes cognitively, I suppose. But I think because we were working with more marginalized groups, and I'm also doing that here in the more deprived areas of the city. So in the way that we would teach young people what a poem is, because they have no idea what a poem is a lot of the time, they've never seen or heard a poem before. I'm working now with young people who have never seen a piece of live theatre before. We're almost asking them to create something that they have no context for. So that's why recently I brought in this new strand of the project to have them sort of give some ideas to a professional theatre company. The company goes away and creates a piece of theatre and comes back and performs it to them with their ideas in it. Because before we can ask them to do anything drastic like create a piece of theatre, they need to know what a piece of theatre is. And most of them have never been to a theatre, and the theatre is open now, but still a lot of people don't want to go to a theatre, don't want their child to go to a theatre necessarily at the moment. So bringing it to them is an easier way to make that happen. Yeah, in terms of the school systems, I mean, again, that's hard to know because I didn't really work in schools for writing through either. It was more NGOs. But I think you see a lot of similarities in terms of creativity being stifled by people, by schools, which is kind of sad. But it's almost like a subconscious thing. Some teachers we've worked with have just said things like, "Oh, I'm so sorry, this group just aren't creative." And it's like, oh, like, you know, and that's why we need to work with the teachers as well. That's a huge part of it. And it's the same in Cambodia, actually a lot in Singapore, I think, as well. Just creativity being a thing that only some people have and others don't, and not a thing that can be explored with everyone.
I found the same thing when I started really looking closely at the educational system in the US. You know, creativity tends to be something that people often say, well, we don't have time for that. I mean, we have to teach for the test. You know, we have to get through this curriculum. We don't have time, with the assumption that it's something that's very specialized and off to the side and doesn't have anything to do with anything else. Mm-hmm. That's one of the reasons why I knew that I wanted to work in the US as well as in Asia. And, you know, in the back of my head, having raised my own kids in the UK, I was thinking, you know, I think we want to be in the UK too.
I think that a part of what we were trying to do, what you guys are doing with writing through, is creating a voice for the voiceless, or however you want to term it. And the kind of language that we use in my job now is democratizing the arts. It's really the same thing. It's just giving more access to more people. And even the theatre that I work for, which is a huge institution, they're redeveloping their business plan, and it's all around accessing more people that they wouldn't usually access. And it's all in line with a new manifesto and principles from the Arts Council. So I think the country is actually almost, in the arts industry, is almost thinking about that as well, in terms of a lot more inclusion in the groups that are able to access the arts. And there's a lot of work around community engagement happening as well.
That's great.
Especially, I think, because a lot of this has been thrown up from the pandemic, because this could all happen again and we could go back into lockdown, and we need to have contingency plans for that. And so in people's communities, they still need access to the arts. It's really important. And we can't just wait for the theatres to open again. We need to be able to bring it to them somehow.
Yeah, I think I've seen that in a lot of NGOs, that taking the pandemic as an opportunity, because a lot of our programming has had to shut down. We've been forced to either shut down ourselves or look inward and say, okay, now what can we do to respond to what's going on? How can our programming change? How can our organization or our missions change? Yeah, so I think that that's really happening a lot across the nonprofit sector. And that's a good thing. That means we're all evolving. And as you said, you know, the pandemic is not going away anytime soon. And it's very likely going to be something that comes and goes and comes and goes. And the ability to ride those waves is really important.
It's really interesting, actually. So this concept of co-creation, this is what this project is all about. And I thought I understood what it was, and it turns out no one understands what it is, really. And I've been going to these national co-creation focus groups who have had these international expert speakers on co-creation come to each session and do a talk. And it turns out that no one in the world really can define co-creation, because everyone's doing it differently and everyone believes it's something else. And some people push it really far and some people do it at a much lower level. It's difficult to describe, but I guess essentially the kind of basis of it, most people say that it is about process over product. So making the journey of creating a piece of art the point of it rather than the product. And this one kind of professional spoke about how you have in the room, you have artists, everybody's an artist, and then you have professional artists and non-professional artists. You don't have participants and leaders, you don't have teachers and students, you don't have children and practitioners or whatever. You just have artists and non-professional artists, because everybody in that room brings something different to the table. So whilst we work with a big group of artists and they all go into the schools and they deliver their sessions, and some of them are writers, some are directors, some are actors, some are puppeteers, some are dancers, all different kinds. They bring their expertise, their skills and their experience, but the young people are also bringing their experience of life, and they're bringing their opinions and they're bringing their thoughts and their imaginations, and they have stuff that we couldn't do without them and they couldn't do without us. And so it's kind of about balancing the power a little bit and having no power in the space at all. And that's a really hard thing to do because so many things come into play there. And there's been lots of conversations that I've been in recently about how does money come into that? You know, one guy was saying that he never pays anyone to participate in any of his projects because as soon as you introduce money, then it becomes a different thing. But then it's also like, well, artists need to be paid, you know? So I think for me, I'm still kind of figuring out what it means, but it's just about giving agency to young people and having them feel a sense of ownership over a piece of work and having an exchange of ideas and having some value on those ideas and having a process of discovery. All the schools we work with, all the artists we work with and the young people, they've produced something at the end of it. Whatever that was, they've produced something, but they've all had this kind of journey of exploration.
How do you help them access their imagination? What are you doing with, let's say, a group of 8 or 10-year-olds to let them know not only are they now allowed, giving them permission, but how do they access it? What skills or techniques are you using?
Well, every artist is different. See, I don't do it because I'm just the management, you know? So it's the artists that they bring their skill set into the room. And I mean, a lot of them sit down and have a very kind of casual conversation at first with the young people and just get them talking and go on and on and on with it to the point where sometimes I think the young people have been a bit like, what's going on? Like, when are we going to start? But actually they're just having a conversation, just talking about what did you watch on TV last night? What's your favorite food? Like, what did you eat? And then they just bounce ideas off of each other. And they do storytelling activities. So like, you know, starting a story and everyone has to continue it on. We work with 2 special schools, and those young people have been working with artists who have introduced a different art form to them in each session. So one time they did some movement work, one time they did some drumming, one time they did some comedy. And you could see then which ones they were more drawn to and which they weren't. And then the young people who gravitated more to one thing, they would then take those young people and say, okay, work with me on this. Show me your best beat on this drum. Even if they have never played a drum before in their life. Again, it's that whole thing, no mistakes, you know, like it doesn't matter, just do whatever you want because no one's judging. And then they do that, and then they take that and maybe put it in the final piece. There was someone else at these co-creation sessions talking about how we shouldn't change young people's work and we shouldn't develop it into something professional because their ideas and their work is art in itself, which I don't know how much I agree with that. And it's the same in writing through, because we did have points where we edited their work to make it into a beautiful poem using their ideas.
I think it's a definitional issue as well. You know, what is the definition of professional? You know, traditionally it's a matter of money. Mm-hmm. You know, so you want to take a poem and sell it either in a book or or a story, you know, in a magazine, whatever. That's one thing, and that's certainly not anything that we ever do, nor that you're looking to do. To me, the editing process and taking somebody's work and helping them in their own way get it to be as good as possible, that's a positive. You know, I don't see how that could possibly be a negative. It's also a skill in writing in general. that nothing comes out perfect the first time. The people who are the most successful are generally the people who allow themselves and force themselves sometimes to rewrite and rewrite and rewrite 8, 10, 12 times.
Yeah. And I think the process over product thing, it's important, but I think you have to look at it a little bit critically, because if you're just producing something that is rubbish, but the young people have had a great process of learning, is that fair on them to just have a rubbish outcome? Like, they all need to take ownership and pride in this final piece of work. So it needs to be good, and it can be good, but that takes artist expertise to go in there and develop that. So if you keep it completely as their own work, I don't think that's co-creation, because then that's not bringing in the professional side.
To me, I think of it as skill set. People who work more in the arts, they get better at what they do, like athletes, like anyone, and so their skills develop. And that's ultimately what process, I think, should be about too, is helping to develop and evolve skills. Once those skills evolve, the product gets better, quote unquote, better, more sophisticated, more imaginative, whatever. But that's because your skill set is getting better and the techniques are evolving. And from an educational point of view, I think that's what we do, isn't it? Otherwise, it's not that it's bad, but it's a different thing. It's play.
Yeah. And then it's also a thing on, like, some people say there's a spectrum of co-creation, and at one end is full proper co-creation, and at the other end is participation, which participation is what most, I'm just talking in terms of theatre and performance now, but is what most kind of drama workshops do, or drama teachers teach, is participation. That's when you put on a play and you teach young people how to do that, and they participate in it, and then they perform, or they direct, or they write. But co-creation is much more than that. And like I said, I'm still trying to figure out exactly what that means. So another part of it is introducing young people to different areas of the industry in terms of careers. I mean, we're particularly working with quite young children, 8 to 14, but most of them are under 11. And so they're not looking for their careers just yet, but for them to be exposed to other areas of the theatre world, because a lot of them are put off immediately because they don't want to be on stage, which is fair. But, they might want to be a lighting designer or a costume designer, or, something. And for them to have exposure to that and access to that as well is another thing. Within the city, in these areas, they don't necessarily know these things exist, and these youth theatres exist, and they don't know that they can go along to the youth company at the Theatre Royal without having to be on stage. So part of allowing them to access their imagination and co-create is giving them permission and letting them know that it's here and it's available, and you're able to do this. You don't have to only do this.
It also makes me think about the word collaboration. I did a lot of work in theater in the past, and to me, the thing that I always loved about the theater is that it is a collaborative effort, in the way that when I sit down and write a novel, it's not. And I really miss that about not working in the theater at the moment. And actually, that's one of the things I love about running this business, this nonprofit business, is the collaborative part of it. But collaboration, isn't that what co-creation is?
Yeah, I think so. I think that's exactly what it is. It's just, I think there's a lot of kind of social stuff entrenched in it. As kind of a society, we put children and young people lower than adults. So that's always going to be in it. And especially if you're going into schools and working, it's really difficult to navigate that when the schools already have their systems and their protocol set up, and you don't want to tread on any toes, because we need them, we want to work with them. We want to work with them well. But at the same time, we're trying to go in and say, let go of all your rules for now, because we want to just do this and explore this. And we always get teachers being like, oh, sorry, this child is a bit like this and can't do this, and this group isn't very creative, or the teacher doesn't want to get involved. And that's because they have a job and they've had a very stressful year, understandably, and they have all these boxes to tick, which is another thing, because as everyone working in the arts has outcomes to meet, because everyone is funded, or hopefully people are funded. And one of these expert speakers said, if you have any outcomes on a project, then you cannot truly do co-creation. I was like, great, so we've already failed. So it was kind of like, it makes sense in theory, but then there's no way you can't have outcomes, because you have to have outcomes in order to get funding, and you have to be meeting these outcomes. But he was right in that we're forever trying to check boxes. And if you're doing that, then you're not really going with the flow of what everyone in the space is trying to create. But I think I've realized that it's more about, you can have these outcomes, but you can't have a planned output. So you're not planning for this final piece of work that you can imagine in your head. You should go in having no imagination of what that's going to turn out like. But you do know that these are the skills we want to give young people. These are the people we want to reach. These are the communities we want to work with. We want to give them more access to arts and things like that.
Well, certainly, as we've discussed many, many times over the years, we have this thing called M&E, monitoring and evaluation that we all have to do. I suppose they have to do it in the for-profit world, but also in the nonprofit world a lot, because we all have to go for funding. But that is something that you do after the fact. Well, although I know that sometimes you do feel like you have to create a program in order to get the funding that is looking to fund a certain sort of a thing.
I mean, that's exactly what we're doing. So the funding was offered, but we had to create the bid for it. And they gave us outcomes, but they didn't design our program. We had to design it completely ourselves. The monitoring, this is what I'm learning. The monitoring is easy. Super easy, because it's just literally numbers. Like, how many young people are you reaching? How many boys, how many girls, what ages, like just things like that. But the evaluation, we have an external local evaluator who does it all, but that's ongoing, like throughout, always. So whilst it does kind of feel like, yeah, we do the evaluation at the end when it's all done, and then we'll figure out what it was all about. But actually it has to be ongoing, especially with a co-creation project, because it's also supposed to be co-created strategically and from all levels. So supposedly, this is another problem I've kind of come up against, is the systemic stuff and the hierarchies in the project, which some people have had problems with, because it's supposed to be co-created in terms of everyone on the project, so the management and the artists and the schools and the young people and the teachers. But then that gets very political, because you have to have some kind of hierarchy in order for it to work. And some people have to be employed by other people, and artists have to be commissioned by other people. And if you don't have people who are decision makers, then nothing's ever going to happen. You can collaborate and you can have opinions from all sides, but you can't be collaborating with 30 people every time you make a decision. This is what I've learned the hard way, really, because I tried to do that and it just doesn't work. But there is quite a lot of pushback against that. And I think a lot of that comes from freelancers feeling a bit unstable and worried about work, which is absolutely fair. But it's very difficult to be a decision maker when everybody wants it to be fully co-created at all levels.
Thanks so much for listening. Jess and I covered so much that it was enough for 2 episodes. You can listen to part 2 of this interview right now, where we get into her experience facilitating the Writing Through workshop in different countries and how culture affects what is written about. Here's a little taste.
I think sometimes we can all kind of get a bit in our heads about trying to be creative and make something amazing. But actually, the best metaphors, for example, that young people in some workshops have come out with have been so simple that I wouldn't even think of it, because I'd think, oh, that's too simple. But actually, in a poem, it really works and it's amazing.
If you've enjoyed this podcast, please consider rating, leaving us a review, and subscribing. Also, if you could recommend the podcast to anyone in your life you think might like it, we'd be so grateful. We are a new podcast, so this really helps us out. From the Magic Pencil is a collaborative product of the staff and volunteers of Writing Through, including founder and executive director Sue Guiney and deputy director Kristen Schuster. It is edited and produced by our operations coordinator, B. Rice. We would like to give special thanks to our interns, Rachel Walkman and Eva Phelps, without whom these podcasts would not have been possible. If you are interested in donating, volunteering, or partnering with Writing Through, or just finding out a little bit more about what we do, you can check out our website at www.writingthrough.org. Find us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and LinkedIn, or email us at info@writingthrough.org. Until next time, thank you so much for listening. Ever onward.